Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. I have with me today Chris Scheid. He is the co-founder of MyCarrier, and he is truly an expert in LTL shipping. If you really don't know a lot about less-than-truckload transportation, you should listen to this podcast because you're going to be hearing from one of the top experts in the field. But maybe you've got a lot of experience in LTL shipping, but you want to make it streamlined in your company. Well, this company, MyCarrier, has a platform to do that. So in any case, I think you'll find this quite interesting. And Chris does a great job of explaining what some of the idiosyncratic terms mean in LTL. LTL is full of idiosyncrasies, and you'll hear that. You'll also learn a little bit about the difference between LTL and truckload and the similarities between LTL and parcel. So I think you're really going to like this. Chris has tremendous experience. Like I said, he co-founded MyCarrier over 7 years ago, and it's become a very successful platform used by many companies. Prior to that, he was with Global Trans, and he was vice president of pricing. So he has quite a broad experience in this field. And if you go to the MyCarrier website, you'll see they're replete with information. If you want to learn more, if this is just a teaser for you and you want to learn even more, they have great podcasts and short videos and all kinds of resources on their website to help you learn more about LTL shipping. But today, we cover all kinds of things. We talk about also things like how this concept of absolute minimum charge. We talk about the difference between LTL pricing and truckload pricing. We talk about how density pricing can be used, and we talk about how the origin and destination have a big impact on your rates in LTL. We talk about best practices and filling out bills of lading in LTL. Talk about how you can better manage on-time delivery using LTL carriage. We talk about the importance of API integration and how MyCarrier can help with that. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. You're definitely going to learn a lot. So enjoy. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
So, Chris, how would you describe MyCarrier to someone who's not familiar with it?
At the simplest core, we're a shipping platform that connects shippers with their carriers and digitizes that transaction for both parties. Really, we came across this idea back in 2016, and we were looking at the market, and there was clearly a need. Enterprise shippers have had access to technology for decades, but when you're in that small to mid-market category, typically you're still reliant on Excel sheets, paper folders, or leveraging a tech-enabled broker. So we saw there was a big opportunity to democratize access to technology to that segment. So we set apart building MyCarrier. We're a software platform that focuses on allowing the shipper to directly integrate with their direct carriers, right? So directly integrate to their rates, dispatching, e-bill waiting, tracking, documents, and so forth. So really was kind of the first time as a small to mid-market shipper, you could go ahead and set up all your carriers, be onboarded in a matter of minutes, as opposed to months through a project management approach to EDI setup, tariff loading, and many other items to go live with a system. So really, that was the genesis of MyCarriers. How can we democratize access to technology to this market?
It is amazing how many business processes continue to use spreadsheets and even paper, and people taking pictures of things with their phone on the screen. But so before we get into this much deeper, we're talking about LTL, less than truckload, and it's something that, of course, anyone in our business knows a lot about if you're in logistics or supply chain. But we also have listeners that may not be as familiar with the concept of LTL. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Less than truckload is a unique kind of category between parcel and full truckload. It's not as big as the other two, being a little over 50 billion annually, but it provides the benefits of kind of both modes of transportation for that sweet spot in the middle. So especially with what you saw in the parcel space, there's increasing rules, right, on overdimensional or overweight freight, in which there's some pretty punitive charges, especially when we hit some high capacity. So those fees really went up. So when you have freight deliveries and you don't have, a full truckload, or the economics aren't going to make sense there, LTL is a great middle ground when you're shipping that 1 to 6 pallets, potentially even greater, but really to be able to, get the benefit of a hub and spoke model, kind of like you have in parcel, to where you're not buying dedicated capacity in a market in which you might be only using a fraction of that truck. So really being able to spread the cost across numerous shipments. The other nice part about less than truckload is it's on demand. So, in truckload, you're sourcing a driver, where they might be, and trying to find that capacity. LTL, they're really built on the model where they can flex and flow with what is coming in different markets. And so you can just call up, or we'll get into it later, just through APIs and other things, just instantly notify carriers of your shipment, and there's no need for sourcing. So really kind of a simple middle ground that can provide a lot of cost efficiencies if you're not filling up a full truck.
It is interesting because after the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, when freight transportation was deregulated, LTL and truckload emerged. And so for those of you listening that may not know, a truckload doesn't mean you're shipping a full truckload. It's just a type of transportation where you're contracting on a truckload, so a 53-foot trailer. And so you're going from point A to point B, generally speaking. There are some exceptions where you have stop-offs and things like that. But generally you're buying transportation capacity from point A to point B. So you could put one pallet in it, but it would be a lot more efficient to use LTL if you just have a pallet, because as Chris was saying, LTL is set up to where they have these hubs. It's a hub and spoke model. So they'll drive around and they'll pick up pallets. They bring it back to a facility where it's cross-docked and then put on trucks to go line haul to another break bulk facility where it's again cross-docked and then delivered. And so it's a way to consolidate a bunch of shipments into small shipments, but LTL is very hard to get into. Anyone can buy a truck,
entry.
Right? Anyone can get into truckload trucking, but boy, you've got so many assets to buy. It's a lot more expensive, but it's also complicated. In some ways, it's more complicated, and in some ways, it's less complicated. You were talking about the way it's less complicated in the sense that it's easy to procure, relatively speaking. But on the other hand, it's complicated because of things we'll talk about later. But before we do that, could you talk a little bit about how LTL shipping pricing differs from truckload pricing?
Yeah. So pretty much truckload and LTL are completely different in how it's handled. While they're both freight, you would see a lot more similarities in how LTL's pricing to parcel than you do on the truckload side. So when you're dealing with what you're taking up in a truck, what lane you're going in, and to your point, right, around how the carrier network's laid out, their terminals and their break bulks are going to provide, an understanding of where the carrier's costs are. And what they're going to do is, unlike just bidding on a per mile basis in truckload and coming up with a rate for that lane, pretty much a fixed rate. And there could be a couple accessorials in that space. But again, that would usually be declared in very much a fixed price up front. Where less than truckload, it's very dynamic based off of exactly what you're shipping. And, the industry is increasingly getting complex based on how your pricing is established, right? Whether it be based off the class system or density or new ways of pricing that are getting established. But the simplest way you could look at it is you have about 4 variables that are initially going to go into it. Your origin zip code, your destination zip code, you're going to have your freight class traditionally, and then your weight, right? And those 4 variables are going to be able to do a lookup to figure out what your per hundredweight is and at what scale within that per hundredweight you land. And not to get too deep or geeky, right? As you start moving up and down in the weight brackets, you move up and down the per hundredweights as there's some more efficiencies for carriers as you move into some larger shipments. So once you look up that per hundredweight, you're going to apply it against the total weight of the shipment, and you're going to have your base rate for that shipment. And we'll get into it later, but a lot of other fees can come along, and they're going to be likely variable based off of the size of your shipment or type of service you're asking for from a carrier, right? So inside delivery, it's going to vary on the amount of time it takes if you're shipping, 1 pallet, or maybe you have 12 pallets, right? It's going to be a different amount of effort that goes into it.
Well, for a earlier stage company just getting into the point where they have to ship LTL to be efficient, or it could even be a company that's been shipping truckload and they start a new division or a new product line where they need to ship LTL. But in either case, when you're new to having to ship various products through LTL, it kind of gets complicated. In fact, some of the terminology we're using already would be maybe not people wouldn't know about it, even if they had lots of experience in other areas of transportation. So if you're new to it and you have to use the NMFC, as it's called, National Motor Freight Transportation, and it helps you with coming up with density pricing. Could you explain a little bit about how MyCarrier's platform can help simplify this process for people that are new in the industry?
Yeah, I've actually talked to many new startup companies, and to your point, there's a lot of different acronyms and complexity from the deregulation days kind of carrying over, and it can be difficult, right? A lot of these startup companies don't maybe have someone that has had experience or been around this industry for a long time. So I think there's a big movement in our industry to say, hey, we'll continue to support how shippers are accustomed to doing business, but there's new ways that can communicate rates. And one of those is density. And I honestly see for some new startup companies, it's in the carrier and shipper's benefit to look at some of those new programs to just be able to speak on that same language right out of the gate. If they're familiar with parcel, it's natural to start understanding that as it's a similar kind of carryover, a little different, but the dim weight aspect you'd have in parcel. So it's got some genesis there, but some of the companies I've talked to are, for example, people starting doing fulfill by Amazon, right? They need to get 4 or 5 pallets to each of the Amazon fulfillment, and they don't know how to freight class. And also, you have a lot of mixed goods and things where you get into complexity of multiple freight classes and multiple NMFC numbers onto a single pallet. And now start trying to derive density at a single unit within a greater unit, the math there gets complex. So what we've seen is if you are looking to get up and going with less than truckload, I would suggest talk with a carrier about asking for density-based pricing out of the gate. You're never going to have to change in the future if the industry does move this way. And also, we do know the NMFTA, who sets the NMFC and coordinates that, the governing body, right? They continue to move more and more items away from being fixed or static kind of definition into more density-based. Again, the scales can vary by different items due to things like stowability, handling, liability. So if you go straight to just density pricing, it's going to also benefit you as you grow your company. You can start looking. I was talking with a company that was importing bikes, and they had some decent transportation costs, but what they did was they focused on reducing how the, freight's positioned on the pallet and being able to work on the size of those boxes to where they could fit more in a given area, right? And in less than truckload, it's different than truckload. The vast, vast majority of time, the carrier's truck is going to dim out. You're going to fill up the whole capacity of that truck before you're going to fill up the legal weight of that truck, right? And even if you do have a heavy shipment, they could still potentially spread that across multiple line haul trucks to just spread out that weight. Again, a very rare problem. So really, you're paying for the space you occupy. So it also is going to incentivize you. When you're having that conversation with your carrier, it's not just, I need better rates. You can have a more collaborative conversation of, hey, what can be done in packaging? What can I do to be able to drive down the space I use while also drive down the carrier's costs? And you get in some pretty easy win-win situations where sometimes the historic way our industry has done it just hasn't been able to account for those kind of changes and hasn't incentivized the shipper to think about those things. Rather, just focus on beating the carrier up and, really pushing on the rates.
This idea of thinking of your product in terms of how it affects transportation costs at the design stage is so critical. And, companies have started off of this. IKEA really started from that concept. Furniture that could be taken apart and shipped, and then the customer puts it together. Those kind of concepts. So, Chris, there's a concept of an absolute minimum charge, AMC, and LTL. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So that's kind of where you get into some of your smaller shipments, right? And this gets into that line between what is parcel and what's the less than truckload. And when you have less than truckload, you have CDL drivers for the most part, right? You might have some local pickup drivers driving straight trucks that might not need it, but you do have a heavier, larger, more expensive piece of equipment and driver doing that pickup. So there are what's called an absolute minimum charge, in which is the absolute lowest that the carrier will move that shipment for. So back to when I got into the rating, we talked about that per hundredweight, and you would receive a discount off of that. Now, at a certain point, there's that line in the sand in which it won't go below that amount, and it can vary. It can vary based off lane, state, different parts of the region of the country, but really it reflects kind of that bare cost associated. So it wouldn't make sense if you had something that was within the 150 parcel pound limit. It's within those, dimensional categories that would be allowed to ship in that environment. It might make more sense because there's some more costs that go into less than truckload shipping. So it really draws that line of what's the absolute minimum, but you also have to keep in mind after that minimum charge, there is fuel that would be put on top of that. So when you're calculating, and that's where systems can be extremely helpful, right? You might have a tariff with your carrier and it has your minimum charge. You don't want to be sitting out there figuring out what's my discount, would that apply, would my minimum? This is where in the enterprise space, they've always had systems where they can load these contracts, they can rate them, and they can understand these costs. The way we've been able to get to the SMB market is by, instead of focusing on loading every single customer's tariff for every single carrier, this is where APIs and rating came into play. And now we can sync directly with the carrier system and in real time pull back your contracted rate with the carrier. So you don't have to worry about your minimum charge, how to calculate it, what's the DOT current, or where's the DOE, have the current fuel price, do your table lookup of what that correlates to. All that's done automatically in milliseconds, so you can see. And back to your prior point, right, around density pricing, we're talking about how could a system enable that. We looked at, when we built MyCarrier, was building for today, but architecting for the future. And that's where we focused on is, hey, you can put in all of your information, right, as you do it today. But let's just say you want to start shipping density. We already have created the tools in which you're putting in that information that behind the scenes, you could talk with the carrier, adjust your agreement, and nothing in your business has to change. The APIs would pull it in, and we have all the information we need to just seamlessly switch you. Because a lot of times, shippers, changing something like that is very disruptive to the organization because of how their systems work. So we really focused on knowing where the industry likely might go and really building the building blocks for that as the industry moves there.
Well, Chris, you mentioned in your discussion there the effect of the origin and destination on the rate, and so could you elaborate on that a little bit more, and also include the concept of interlining?
Yeah. So the origin and destination can play a big role in the rate, and also it can vary a bit by on the rate base, right? If you're using a carrier rate base versus Zarlite. I've done some analysis back in the past, and I can't say off the most recent rate basis if it holds true, but you have metro point pickups and you have extended more rural points. And to our prior conversation about this hub and spoke model, you're going to have a pickup that's going to need to bring it back to that terminal. So they're just going down the block, picking up from another industrial commercial site. That's a pretty low cost to go service that. Where if you're going way out into extended areas, maybe oil fields or new subdivisions being built far outside the city, that's going to be a lot more travel time, pickup time for the carrier. So that's picked up in your rate base, and that zip code is going to be knowing about how far away it is and what that price is going to incur in that per hundredweight. We've seen historically, I think, in my opinion, carriers can account for that a lot in their rate base. I come from a small town in Wisconsin originally many years ago, and there was only 2 carriers that had a terminal in that city. Every other carrier had to service it from an hour and a half away in Minneapolis. So when you get into these things, the carrier and their rate base and that origin can be reflected into their pricing. So now think about other things, whether it be carbon footprint. You can really focus on where does it go most efficiently, because the carrier is likely going to incentivize that, what makes most sense for them. And then another carrier that doesn't have that same network configuration, their price might be more because it makes less sense. So there's a lot of intricacies around that. And that kind of leads into interlining. So there are carriers out there that have formed some great partnerships and been able to hand off freight. So they might service the Southeast market, but hand off to the Northeast when, freight needs to be delivered there. And what they do is they can pick it up and hand off through a line haul into a main break bulk terminal for that carrier to distribute it. But it's far beyond that, right? It seems simple. Okay, great. Just give it to that carrier. But our industry has done a great job, I think, from a technology perspective about having through pros, right? That's the tracking number in less-than-truckload. That is what you would call up a carrier or use an API to find where your shipment is. They've been able to automate all that to where you can get a single bill from a carrier and have seamless end-to-end tracking. And that might not have been the case, 10 years ago.
Yeah, no question. That is very impressive. So, a lot of what we've been talking about would be really beneficial to someone who is new to LTL shipping. Again, whether they're an entrepreneur or a company that's maybe been doing truckload, now they're starting to do LTL for a new product line or something. And I know MyCarrier can facilitate that, which is a big boon to entrepreneurs. But I'm curious if you think about some of the very basic things people need to be able to do, like filling out a bill of lading. something that basic. What are some best practices for completing a bill of lading for LTL?
Yeah, that's an important part of this industry, and one thing that's held back for a while that I think we're on the cusp of it changing. So a bill of lading has a lot of downfalls. You can get a standard template that you can fill out. I would highly recommend that at a bare minimum, right? Use some kind of template. Any one of your carriers will give that to you, and you can obviously write the information that you're shipping on there. There's many pitfalls to that approach, right? So that might have worked, decades ago, but the problem we run into today is you're reliant on handwriting and then the carrier taking that information and being able to make sure they understand every bit of your handwriting, even if it's about the details that will go into the rate, or you might be trying to communicate to them about delivery requirements that are important. If they can't read your handwriting, that's not going to get into their computer system to be able to do that. So I would say if you are reliant on paper and that's what you have in place today, at least use a computer printout of that document. That's going to make it far easier for the clerk, or many carriers are now starting to use OCR and other tools and computer vision to be able to read these documents. So you're going to have a higher accuracy rate. But really, now with the advent of technology, I would really advocate for an e-bill of lading. And it's just come on the scenes. The Digital Council has established a standard that's starting to receive broad adoption across carriers. And this is where you're going to really cut down on billing issues. So I was talking with several different carriers, and on average, 50% of billing errors are because they can't read the bill of lading, and things are going to get obviously transcribed in different ways that are going to affect your rate. When you're dealing with an e-bill of lading, it's a one-to-one record, right? What you have entered into a system is going to be digitally transferred exactly to the carrier, bit for bit of what you wanted to communicate, and that's going to go into your invoice. So not only now are you going to receive an accurate invoice with exactly the details you provided, but the carrier is going to know all the specifics for that shipment, whether it be delivery or special instructions that they needed to know about that. So there's going to be a lot of efficiencies to derive in our industry on that. And that's where we focused on being an early adopter at MyCarrier, that there's nothing the shipper has to do. All they have to do is start entering their orders through our system, and behind the scenes, it's all done. So you don't even have to think about setting up these integrations, developing to this standard. It just happens seamlessly behind the scenes.
Again, I can see how that would be so valuable to an entrepreneur. I mean, think about someone who gets into a new business like, I don't know, maybe they're making dry heat saunas. Dry heat saunas are becoming really popular now.
Mhm.
But they're usually going to be shipped LTL, and I think many people that might get into that business, maybe they were in a similar kind of business, and now they've maybe become more efficient. They have some economies of scale, and so they want to start shipping nationally. This kind of a system could really help them dramatically with that.
Think about it from all sides. I mean, it literally is a scan and go experience, right? As soon as you have e-bill of lading, we can put that barcode right on a shipping label. The carrier scans it. It's all in their computer system, right? You don't now need a CDL driver sitting there typing information into a handheld, taking time, taking resources. And while that truck might be idling, right, having a cost on fuel as well. So I think you're going to see less than truckload, where it was kind of treated as freight and was operated a bit from a shipper perspective like truckload. I see it's far more like a parcel-like experience, where it's much more of a scan and go, one-for-one tracking. And we've seen the advent. Carriers are investing, right? You mentioned high barriers to entry. A lot of the carriers are public or well north of $1 billion in revenue. So they're investing in technology, and it's going to be possible to really see the whole industry, I think, here in the next few years be broadly digitized.
You mentioned earlier accessorial charges, but I think there could be a number of people listening to this that wouldn't know what that meant. Would you mind describing that?
Yeah, so for those who don't know what it is, there's probably a lot of viewpoints in our industry for those that do. It is not a well-liked topic. It's kind of been a necessity of the industry. And as we've expanded and gone through that last recession, there's been pressure on carriers for pricing, right? There used to be a bit more of kind of a all-in price. But now as consumers or businesses are pushing for wanting, affordable shipping rates, when the carrier does have to go out of their way or provide additional services that are going to incur additional costs for them, that's what really an accessorial is. And there can be many of it. And the reason I get it's a frustration point in our industry is there's more than them than there is in the parcel industry. There's a lot more, but there's more that goes into freight. And also on truckload, it's usually included or expected in the overall service that's being provided and communicated upfront, whether it be tarps or some basic services. So in less than truckload, your most common one, and the one I see the most, is really going to be about the site type, right? So when they deliver to different types of sites, behind a gate, right, at a prison, there's going to be time incurred to make those deliveries. You're going to have a limited access delivery or a residence, right? It's just not as efficient as a commercial location in the heart of the city where they can go stop to stop very quickly. There's going to be more dwell time, more travel time. Also, there's going to be services, whether you get into inside delivery, right? Sometimes they call it non-adjacent, to where you're going to want to take it further into your facility because you don't have the equipment to do that. You're going to get into times in which you want your customer to be notified or an appointment. This has been an interesting one in our industry where it was common that every shipper wanted notify, deliver. But what happens when you call a consignee? They say, that's great. Can you deliver at this time? So now it's an appointment. Well, think about it. Just like many people are familiar with how UPS does that they route that truck driver very specifically to be most efficient. Well, when you set an appointment, you've now taken that truck out of their natural delivery to optimize that, incurring additional charge. So I think where there is, some general contention on this topic in our industry, I think there's also a reason these things have had to come around to correctly reflect. Now, what I would recommend to shippers is make sure you identify upfront what type of services you need from a carrier. They publish all of these in a condensed form of what their fees are and say, hey, this is what's going to apply to my business, and negotiate and work with a carrier that makes sense for those specific fees. Don't try and negotiate things. If you never ship to a prison, probably not worth, spending your time negotiating those. Focus on the areas that are important to your business and find a fee structure that's going to work for both parties.
So I'd like to talk just briefly about on-time delivery. A lot of our listeners, especially the shippers, feel a lot of pressure, especially from retailers, to deliver on time. And, if I could take a pallet and contract for a full truckload, assuming I could get the capacity, and right now I would be able to, and I could ship it from here to the final destination. The truck's going to be mostly empty and it's going to be more expensive, but I can get there at I can pretty much estimate when it's going to arrive. What are some variables that affect on-time delivery in LTL?
Yeah. So I think the process starts even before you hand it to the carrier. And I think that's where a lot of times shipments could be set up for failure from the beginning. If you're looking for your must deliver by date and you're shipping it exactly to the carrier's specification, you're not leaving much wiggle room for things to go wrong, whether it be weather or a lot of time, these are big box retailers, right? They have appointments. They might not have an appointment left open for that. So it's not even the carrier's fault that they can't make that delivery. So it's just the wiggle room small. And those can be bad. I literally was talking with an investor out there where they got a call from one of their companies. They had missed a must deliver by date, and the chargeback was significant enough that they're having to call their investors, right, to figure out how do we deal with this hit to the business. So I would say when you enter into those agreements, right, you're signing an agreement with someone, you need to have operational thought to what you've just committed to delivering. So you should start thinking well leading up to that about when does that need to be shipped by. And in MyCarrier, that was a little bit what spurred our user interface. When you select your carrier, we focused on a calendar view where it shows you based off of transit time in the day, which carrier would get it, and then the levels of service, right? From standard to guaranteed AM, guaranteed PM. So the whole idea we had was you would look, when does it need to get there and by what level of service, and you can start selecting your carrier. So I'd first recommend, allowing lead time, shipping in advance to it. But when that's not possible, maybe you're just barely getting that last piece on the pallet to make that holiday delivery, is and I don't know where this comes from in our industry. I've heard from some shippers when it comes to guaranteed shipments, they just view it as, okay, I'm paying the carrier more. It's kind of like insurance, and they'll give me my money back if they fail. But I've looked inside the carrier's computer systems and seen it firsthand. There's a lot that goes on. When you guarantee a shipment with a carrier, it's not just, hey, I'm kind of entering into an insurance policy. They're flagging that freight for their dispatcher, for operations, their special notes that come up in their computer system when it's being handled and transported. So when your back is up against the wall, I would say utilize those services as well to just make sure you hit the delivery timing. And keep in mind, there's tools out there. There's services that can provide, real-time weather and how it's affecting the trucking market. You can really go deep into this. But if you're an everyday shipper, I think it's the lead time, planning in advance and providing that, time for the unexpected to happen.
So, Chris, again, for entrepreneurs, small businesses, they may or may not have familiarity with API integration. Could you talk about API integration, how important it is, and how it helps a shipper become a shipper of choice, if you will?
Yeah, to make it simple, there's all these acronyms in technology and freight in every industry pretty much out there, right? So people hear API and go, I don't know what that is. To really simplify it, API is an application program interface. That sounds complex, but you deal with a human user interface every single day of your life, right? Interacting with websites, your phone, what have you. All an API is just a standard in how computers have agreed to talk. So if you might go type in information on a field on a website, that's just the same thing. There's a field, and this is the way the computers map and talk. So at the basic, it's that simple. But the advantage that these connections are providing is the real-time flow of information and also error handling. Right on a screen, you see when you have an invalid entry. Now in real time, these computer systems, which EDI didn't allow, would be able to send back that's invalid, be able to correct it, and have these systems seamlessly talk. So what we've seen is the advent now of the first time ever, a truly digital end-to-end shipment. And what I mean by that is we actually saw one executed here recently where, in this case, the customer was using NetSuite. They had an integration to our system. Our system ingested that order, was able to go ping every one of their carriers, receive the rates, receive the transit times, receive all the levels of service. They established rules based off of what they needed to be able to then execute that shipment, going digitally over the carrier, right? E-bill of lading. The carrier has it digitally. They have a one-to-one record there. And then that barcode, the shipping label, is ready to go and just be put on that shipment. Shipment's invoiced, comes back to us, and then we can audit it, put it right back into the carrier system, the shipper system. So I think we're seeing is now where many, many different people would have had to be involved along the way, whether it be entering information into computer systems or printing it out and all these manual processes. It can really be automated to not only save people a tremendous amount of time so they can focus on exception management and what's, most important, to be able to just let it flow and be able to not get into discrepancies. And that's a big part. Discrepancies, I don't think the everyday shipper or the entrepreneur that's new to this sees just how much time is going to be consumed when you have inaccurate information and trying to rectify that. It can take 10x the time than a shipment that just had the correct information up front.
One other issue that's kind of interesting, Chris, is for LTL, peak season starts ramping up in August and is really in full gear in October. And that creates a lot of challenges. What are some of those challenges and how can you overcome them?
Yeah. So it's going to be a little bit of what I talked about before about planning ahead. But what I mean this time when you're planning for peak season is your carrier is an important part of that equation, right? If you're going to sit there and go into peak season and then just go tender to whoever you want with no pre-established agreements, nothing, and just say, hey, I'm going to ship. I expect the carrier to perform, right? Okay, I get small shippers might do that in parcel. In the freight industry, you need a bit more lead time. So I would strongly recommend if you have seasonal pushes or different things that are going to significantly, change your volume of shipping, to communicate that upfront to your carrier. they are more than happy to have those conversations, and they will coordinate resources behind the scenes to make sure that they're set up to service your account, that they're expecting X amount. And the one thing I'd say back to the shippers too, and I've seen this happen, is work with your carriers, but also deliver upon what you've agreed to with your carriers, right? They've reserved that capacity and built out capabilities to service you during those peak seasons. Make sure to honor those agreements you have with the carriers and execute there as well.
Well, Chris, this has been really enlightening. And again, congratulations on the company you've co-founded. Very impressive results.
Thank you. It was great. And thanks for having me, Matt.
If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.